The year was 1529, and Europe stood trembling on the fault line of history. To the east, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had risen to unmatched power, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Hungary. To the west, a divided Christendom struggled to hold itself together, fractured by political rivalries, dynastic wars, and even the fires of religious reform. It was in this volatile moment that the fate of Vienna, and with it, perhaps the future of Europe, was to be decided. For centuries, the Ottoman Turks had been the unstoppable force, sweeping across Asia Minor, North Africa, and the Balkans. Their armies were vast, their soldiers hardened by endless campaigns, and their leaders brilliant in strategy and ruthless in ambition. Suleiman himself was not merely a monarch. He was a symbol of imperial destiny, determined to carry the crescent banner deep into Europe. Already, his victories had shaken kingdoms and humbled mighty rulers. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had been the ultimate symbol of Ottoman power. And now, Vienna was to be the next great prize. Vienna, though not the largest or wealthiest city in Europe, stood at a crucial crossroads. It was a gateway between East and West, perched at the very frontier of Christendom. If Vienna fell, the Ottoman armies could march deeper into Central Europe, threatening the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, and beyond. The stakes were not merely political or territorial. They were existential. This was more than a battle for land. It was a battle for the cultural, religious, and political future of Europe itself. But Vienna was not without defenders. Though the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V was embroiled in wars against France and grappling with the Reformation, the city's leaders understood what was at stake. Count Nicholas von Somme, a seasoned veteran of 60 years, and Wilhelm von Roggendorf, another experienced commander, prepared the city for the storm that was to come. The citizens themselves, from nobles to commoners, would soon find their lives entangled in the desperate struggle to defend their walls. As spring turned to summer in 1529, the news spread like wildfire. Suleiman was marching west with one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Estimates ranged from 100,000 to 150,000 men, accompanied by artillery, engineers, and a logistical machine that seemed unstoppable. Alongside them were thousands of camels and horses, carrying supplies for a campaign that many believed would end with the Ottomans planting their banners in the heart of Europe. Panic swept through the countryside as peasants fled before the advancing tide. Towns were abandoned, villages burned, and refugees poured into fortified cities. Vienna, though fortified, became the last line of defense for much of Central Europe. All eyes turned toward its walls, wondering if they could withstand the storm that was about to descend upon them. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic sieges in history. Vienna would either hold, and in doing so, preserve the fragile balance of Europe, or fall, opening the door to a new world shaped by Ottoman might. The fate of nations hung in the balance, and soon the thunder of war drums would echo at Vienna's gates. Suleiman I, known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, was at the peak of his power in 1529. To his subjects, he was Kanuni, the lawgiver, celebrated for his reforms, patronage of culture, and expansion of justice. To Europe, however, he was the unstoppable conqueror, the shadow looming over Christendom. Already, he had carved his name into history with dazzling victories. He had crushed the Hungarians at Mohacs in 1526, a battle so catastrophic that the Hungarian monarchy was left in ruins, its king killed, and its lands exposed. From that victory, the road to Vienna lay open, and Suleiman now sought to march where no Ottoman sultan had before. Suleiman was more than a military leader. He was a master of strategy and symbolism. To extend the Ottoman frontier deep into Central Europe was not merely about conquest. It was about establishing supremacy, demonstrating that no Christian fortress was beyond his grasp. His empire was vast, stretching across 3 continents, yet ambition drove him further. He understood that Vienna was not just a city. It was a hinge of Europe, a gateway to the Holy Roman Empire, and potentially the staging ground for future expansion into Italy, France, and beyond. In assembling his army, Suleiman demonstrated the extraordinary reach of Ottoman power. Estimates of his force vary, but contemporary accounts suggest between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers marched under his command. The These included the elite janissaries, infantry troops raised from childhood to serve the Sultan with unmatched discipline, alongside cavalry, artillery units, and auxiliaries from across the empire's vast dominions. With them came engineers to breach fortresses and a massive supply train to sustain the campaign. The army was as much a spectacle as a weapon. Drums thundered, banners fluttered, and endless columns of men and animals stretched across the horizon. To the terrified peasants and towns that lay in the army's path, it must have seemed like a force of nature, unstoppable and overwhelming. Behind this display was a clear political message. The Ottomans were not just coming to fight. They were coming to conquer and to stay. Yet the march to Vienna was no simple feat. The logistics of moving such an immense host across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain were staggering. Rivers had to be crossed, bridges built, and supply lines maintained. Autumn rains and swollen rivers slowed progress, while disease spread through the camp. Still, the army advanced, relentless in its purpose, driving terror before it. Villages were torched, crops destroyed, and survivors fled in panic, creating waves of refugees that swelled into the cities, still holding out. For Suleiman, however, these obstacles were minor compared to the prize awaiting him. He believed Vienna could be taken, just as Constantinople had been in 1453. The same cannons that had brought down the walls of the Byzantine capital could surely breach the defenses of a city far less imposing. He envisioned Vienna falling swiftly, and with it, the doors of Europe swinging wide open. But what he did not yet know was that Vienna's defenders, though few, were determined to hold the line at all costs. As news spread of Suleiman's advance, Vienna braced for its darkest hour. The city, though strategically vital, was not prepared to withstand such an enormous onslaught. Its medieval walls were aging, its fortifications not nearly as formidable as those of Constantinople or other great bastions of Europe. Yet its leaders knew that to surrender without a fight would spell disaster, not just for Vienna, but for all of Central Europe. Count Nicholas von Somme, 70 years old yet still sharp in mind and spirit, was placed in command of the defense. Alongside him was Wilhelm von Roggendorf, another veteran of many campaigns. These men, though outnumbered and facing overwhelming odds, approached the task with grim determination. They gathered what forces they could, a garrison of around 20,000 soldiers, including German Landsknechts, Spanish infantry, and Austrian nobles with their retainers. To this force were added the townspeople themselves, men, women, and even children, who would soon be drawn into the desperate effort to defend their city. The mood inside Vienna was a mix of fear and resolve. Refugees poured in from the countryside, swelling the population and adding to the strain on food supplies. Churches held prayers, bells tolled, and priests urged the people to stand firm, reminding them that they fought not only for their homes but for Christendom itself. Every able-bodied citizen was called to work. Women carried stones and dirt to reinforce the walls. Craftsmen fashioned weapons, repaired defenses, and constructed makeshift barricades. Even students from the university were armed and prepared to fight. The city's defenses were strengthened as best they could be. Trenches were dug, bastions repaired, and artillery positioned on the walls. Though Vienna's fortifications were far from impregnable, every effort was made to turn them into a shield against the coming storm. The defenders knew they could not hope to match the Ottomans in numbers or firepower. Their only hope lay in resilience, holding out long enough for weather, logistics, and sheer determination to wear down the invaders. As the final days before the siege ticked away, tension gripped the city. Scouts reported the Ottoman army drawing ever closer, a tide of men and horses stretching across the horizon. Panic rose, but so too did defiance. The gates were sealed, the drawbridges raised, and the defenders took their places on the walls. Vienna had become a fortress, not by choice, but by necessity. The people knew they faced annihilation if the city fell. Tales of Ottoman brutality in conquered lands had spread far and wide, stories of massacres, enslavement, and destruction. The defenders clung to the hope that their courage, combined with the mercy of God, would see them through. With every passing hour, the sound of drums and marching feet drew nearer, until at last the banners of the Ottoman Empire appeared on the horizon. Vienna was about to face its trial by fire. When Suleiman's vast army finally appeared before Vienna in late September 1529, the sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Endless ranks of soldiers stretched as far as the eye could see, their banners and standards fluttering in the autumn wind. The thunder of war drums echoed across the plains, and the earth shook under the tramp of horses and the rumble of artillery wagons. To the citizens huddled behind the walls, it must have seemed as if an ocean of war had come to swallow them whole. The Ottomans wasted no time in demonstrating their power. Camps were established in vast encampments surrounding the city, their order and efficiency a testament to the empire's military machine. Tents stretched for miles, filled with soldiers from across the empire's dominions. Turks, Arabs, Persians, Bosnians, Albanians, and more. Each unit had its place, each banner its meaning, and at the center of it all was the Sultan's magnificent tent, a palace of silk and gold that proclaimed the glory of the Ottoman court. The psychological effect on Vienna was immense. The defenders, peering over the walls, could scarcely comprehend the size of the force arrayed against them. Yet if Suleiman had expected a show of power to intimidate the city into surrender, he was mistaken. Instead, the citizens steeled themselves to fight ahead, resolved that their survival depended on defiance. The first actions of the siege were swift and brutal. Ottoman cavalry spread out across the countryside, cutting off Vienna from reinforcements and supplies. Villages and farms in the surrounding area were burned, their inhabitants either slain or captured. The siege ring closed and Vienna was isolated, a lone fortress in a sea of enemies. Artillery was brought forward, though this presented one of the Ottoman army's great challenges. The campaign had been plagued by heavy rains and flooding, and many of the massive cannons that had proven so devastating at Constantinople had been left behind or lost along the march. Those that remained were difficult to position and less effective against Vienna's earthworks and reinforced walls. Still, the Ottomans pressed forward, confident that their engineers and janissaries could breach the defenses. By early October, the siege was fully underway. Mines were dug beneath the walls, explosives prepared to bring down entire sections of the fortifications. Skirmishes erupted as defenders sallied out to disrupt the digging, often engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. Night and day, the clash of steel, the roar of cannon, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the battlefield. For Vienna, the situation was dire, but the defenders proved resourceful. Countermines were dug to intercept the Ottoman tunnels, often leading to desperate underground battles fought in darkness by torchlight. Every breach was patched, every loss met with renewed determination. The defenders understood that their survival depended not on defeating the Ottomans outright, but on holding out long enough for winter and the limits of Ottoman logistics to weaken their enemy. The siege had begun in earnest, and Vienna stood alone, its fate uncertain. The greatest empire of the age was at its gates, and only courage, faith, and stubborn resistance stood in the way of catastrophe. The siege of Vienna quickly escalated into a brutal contest of endurance and ingenuity. The Ottomans unleashed their siege craft with relentless determination. Cannons roared day and night, their iron balls slamming into Vienna's walls with thunderous force. Yet the defenders had prepared, reinforcing weak points with earthworks that absorbed much of the impact. The ancient stone may have cracked, but the city did not crumble. For every breach created, the defenders rushed to repair it, often under fire, risking their lives to keep the walls standing. But artillery was only one weapon in the Ottoman arsenal. Their engineers set about digging tunnels beneath the fortifications. These mines were packed with gunpowder, designed to blow great gaps into walls, allowing the janissaries to pour through. Time and again, the ground shook as explosions ripped through Vienna's defenses, reducing towers and bastions to rubble. Each blast seemed like the beginning of the end. Yet every time, the defenders hurled themselves into the breach, fighting with a desperation born of knowing that behind them lay their families, their homes, and the fate of Christendom. The clashes in these breaches were savage and intimate. The janissaries, famed for their discipline and skill, advanced in tight formations, their curved sabers flashing in the smoky air. The defenders met them with pikes, halberds, and arquebuses, fighting shoulder to shoulder atop makeshift barricades of earth and debris. Women and even children joined the struggle, carrying stones, boiling oil, and burning tar to hurl down on the attackers. The siege was no longer a battle between armies alone. It was a struggle of an entire city against annihilation. Beneath the ground, another war raged. Countermines were dug by Vienna's defenders, desperate attempts to intercept the Ottoman tunnels before they could reach the walls. When the two sides met underground, the fighting was nightmarish, close, dark, suffocating. Battles were fought by torchlight in cramped passageways where smoke and dust choked the air. Pickaxes, daggers, and bare hand became weapons in these subterranean duels. More than once, tunnels collapsed, burying both attackers and defenders alike. The siege became a test of willpower. The Ottomans pressed forward with endless waves, but Vienna's defenders matched them blow for blow. Each failed assault cost the attackers dearly, sapping their strength and morale. Yet with every new breach, the defenders wondered how much longer they could hold. Food grew scarce, casualties mounted, and exhaustion gnawed at every soul within the city. Still, they clung to the walls, praying that winter and salvation was drawing closer. For the people of Vienna, survival during the siege meant enduring unimaginable hardship. The city, already crowded with soldiers and refugees, quickly became a place of hunger, disease, and fear. Supplies dwindled as the Ottoman blockade cut off all hope of resupply. Bread was rationed, meat became scarce, and desperation forced citizens to eat whatever they could find. Horses, dogs, and even vermin found their way into cooking pots as families struggled to endure. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals, their groans echoing through the night. Surgeons worked tirelessly, amputating shattered limbs and dressing ghastly wounds, often without the benefit of proper medicines. The stench of death lingered in the air, for there was little time or space for proper burials. Yet even amid this misery, the spirit of the defenders did not break. Songs of faith were sung in churches. Prayers rose from every quarter, and sermons urged the people to endure, reminding them that God's providence often revealed itself in the darkest of times. Life did not stop inside the walls. It adapted. Women, children, and the elderly all played their roles. While men fought on the ramparts, women carried ammunition, tended to the wounded, and reinforced defenses. Children acted as runners, carrying water, food, and messages through the chaos. Every soul became part of the defense, and the city's resilience became a weapon as powerful as any cannon. At night, fear was at its greatest. Fires lit the sky as Ottoman bombardments continued. Shadows moved outside the walls, and every sound carried the possibility of an attack. Yet the defenders stayed vigilant, ready at moment's notice to rush to their posts. For many, sleep was a luxury measured in minutes, not hours. Exhaustion weighed heavily, but the determination to hold on outweighed despair. Stories of heroism spread through the city, lifting spirits even in the darkest hours. An old soldier fighting side by side with a boy barely into his teens. A group of women dousing the flames of the tower struck by Ottoman fire. Priests blessing soldiers as they marched into battle, offering words of comfort to the dying. These tales became symbols of defiance, proof that Vienna's spirit would not be easily broken. Still, the suffering was immense. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, grief shattered families, and the knowledge that the enemy outside was relentless weighed on every mind. Yet the people clung to hope. Hope that relief would come, hope that the weather would turn, hope that their sacrifice would mean something greater than themselves. In this crucible of suffering, Vienna forged its will to endure. By mid-October 1529, the siege reached its terrible climax. The Ottomans, frustrated by weeks of stubborn resistance, resolved to launch their final all-out assaults. Mines had torn gaping holes in the walls, and the city's defenses were crumbling. Suleiman ordered the Janissaries forward in massive waves, determined to break Vienna once and for all. The fate of the city and perhaps Europe hung in the balance. The assaults were apocalyptic in scale. Drums thundered, horns blared, and the Janissaries advanced with steely precision. Thousands surged into the breaches, their cries echoing like a storm. The defenders, though exhausted and bloodied, met them with everything they had left. Arquebuses spat fire, cannons roared at point-blank range, and men with pikes and halberds stood shoulder to shoulder in desperate resistance. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, and merciless. For every defender who fell, another stepped forward to take his place. The Ottomans pressed hard, but the narrow breaches and the defenders' resolve worked against them. The piles of bodies mounted, turning the battlefield into a nightmare of blood and mud. The Janissaries fought with unmatched discipline, but the defenders' desperation was fiercer still. They knew there was no retreat, no surrender. Behind them lay their families, their homes, and their very survival. To falter meant death for all. As the assaults raged, weather turned against the Ottomans. Autumn rains poured down, turning the fields into seas of mud. Supplies dwindled, disease spread through their camp, and morale faltered. What Suleiman had envisioned as a swift conquest was dragging into a grueling war of attrition. His men were exhausted, their confidence shaken by the sheer stubbornness of Vienna's defense. The final assaults, though furious, failed to breach the heart of the city. Each attempt was met with unyielding resistance, each breach sealed with blood and sacrifice. By late October, it was clear Vienna would not fall. The walls still stood, the defenders still fought, and winter loomed on the horizon. Suleiman faced a bitter choice: continue the siege and risk disaster, or withdraw his battered army before it was destroyed by the elements. On October 14th, 1529, Suleiman made the decision to retreat. The siege had dragged on for weeks, and though Vienna lay battered and scarred, it had not fallen. The weather had turned cold and wet. Supplies were nearly exhausted, and disease plagued the camp. The once mighty Ottoman host, though still vast, was weary and demoralized. The retreat was not a triumph, but a necessity. The withdrawal was as dramatic as the siege itself. Suleiman's army began its march eastward, but the journey was disastrous. Heavy rains turned roads into rivers of mud, wagons sank, and animals collapsed. Rear-guard skirmishes with pursuing forces harassed the retreating columns. Starvation and sickness claimed thousands, and by the time the army reached Ottoman territory, its numbers had been reduced drastically. What had begun as a grand campaign of conquest ended in exhaustion and failure. For Vienna, the retreat was a miracle. Bells rang out across the city. Prayers of thanksgiving filled the churches, and the people celebrated their survival. They had endured hunger, terror, and unimaginable odds, yet they had held the line. The cost had been heavy. Hundreds of defenders and countless civilians lay dead. But the city still stood a battered yet unbroken symbol of defiance. For Suleiman, the retreat was a bitter disappointment. Though he remained the most powerful ruler of his age, the failure to capture Vienna marked the limit of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The siege demonstrated the challenges of logistics, the resilience of determined defenders, and the unforgiving power of weather and terrain. Vienna had proven that even the greatest empire could be stopped. The failure of the Siege of Vienna had immense consequences for Europe. For the Holy Roman Empire, it was a rallying point, proof that unity and determination could withstand even the greatest threats. Vienna became a symbol of resistance, its defenders celebrated as heroes across Christendom. Charles V, though absent during the siege, took pride in the survival of his realm, and the story of Vienna's defense spread across Europe as a tale of hope and triumph. For the Ottomans, the retreat was not a collapse but recognition of limits. The empire remained powerful, and future campaigns would still bring terror to Europe. Yet the myth of Ottoman invincibility had been shattered. Vienna showed that with courage, preparation, and endurance, the tide could be held back. The balance of power in Europe shifted, and though wars would continue, the dream of Ottoman conquest deep into Central Europe was forever tempered. The siege also left scars on Vienna itself. Buildings lay in ruins, fields destroyed, and countless families broken. Yet from this devastation arose a renewed sense of identity. Vienna was no longer just a city at the frontier. It had become the bulwark of Europe, the guardian of Christendom. Its survival in 1529 would echo through history, shaping its destiny for centuries to come. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 was more than a military event. It was a turning point in world history. Had Suleiman succeeded, the map of Europe might look very different today. The Holy Roman Empire could have collapsed, Italy and France exposed, and the Reformation's fragile progress swept away in a tide of conquest. The survival of Vienna ensured that Europe's cultural, political, and religious paths would continue in ways that shaped the modern world. The legacy of the siege is one of endurance against overwhelming odds. It was not merely armies that fought. It was an entire city united in defiance. The courage of Vienna's defenders, from seasoned soldiers to common citizens, proved that even the greatest empire could be resisted. Their sacrifice bought Europe time, preserving its independence at a moment when it seemed poised to fall. For centuries after, Vienna's survival was remembered as a miracle. Artists, poets, and chroniclers immortalized the event, and later generations would look back on 1529 as a year Europe stood on the edge of collapse, only to endure. Though the Ottomans would return in 1683 for another great siege, the story of 1529 remained a testament to resilience. The Siege of Vienna reminds us of the razor's edge on which history often balances. The fate of nations can turn on the courage of a few, the resolve of a city, or the timing of the seasons. In 1529, Europe nearly fell, but did not. And in that survival, the course of history was forever altered. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most dramatic sieges, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the Crit Stories for more epic tales from the past. Drop a comment with the historical event you'd like us to cover next. Your idea might become our next story.